I was 23 years old when I first saw him, standing in snow so deep it would have buried me to my chest. The year was 1974, and I was young enough to believe I was invincible, stupid enough to climb alone, and desperate enough to take risks that should have killed me. My name is Robert Chen, and for 50 years I have kept a secret that would change everything we think we know about intelligence, consciousness, and our place in the natural order. For 50 years, I have met with a being that shouldn't exist, in a place that can't be found, learning truths about humanity that I wish I could unlearn. This is not a confession. This is a warning. I went to the Himalayas in 1970 for running from a life that had collapsed around me. My father had died 6 months earlier, my engagement had ended badly, and I'd been expelled from graduate school for reasons I still believe were unjust. I had some money, no direction, and a half-formed idea that if I climbed high enough, far enough, maybe I could leave my failures at a lower altitude. The Sherpas at base camp tried to warn me. They always do, these mountain people who understand things we educated Westerners dismiss as superstition. An old woman, her face carved by decades of high-altitude wind, grabbed my arm as I was preparing for my solo ascent. "Chaya Manch," she whispered, her grip surprisingly strong. "Shadow Man. He walks these peaks. If he shows himself to you, it means something. It always means something." I thanked her politely and ignored her completely. Shadow men and mountain spirits, the desperate explanations of people who hadn't studied atmospheric physics or understood how altitude affects perception. I was there for the climb, for the solitude, for the clean simplicity of putting one foot in front of another until there was nowhere higher to go. What happens next will challenge everything you believe about what's possible. Subscribe now and hit that notification bell. You won't want to miss a single revelation from this decades-long encounter. The storm hit on my third day above 20,000 feet. Not the gradual weather change you can prepare for, but the sudden, violent assault that the Himalayas are famous for. One moment I was making good progress across a snow field, the next I was blind, fighting wind that tried to rip me off the mountain, snow that cut like glass. I made it to an ice cave, barely more than a depression in a cliff face, but enough to get out of the direct wind. I huddled there as the storm raged, checking my supplies and calculating how long I could survive if it lasted. 3 days of food. Maybe 4 if I rationed. Fuel for a week. Plenty of time. Except the storm didn't stop after 3 days. Or 4. Or 7. By the 9th day, I was hallucinating from hunger and altitude. I knew I was dying, not dramatically, not suddenly, but with the slow, inevitable certainty of a body shutting down one system at a time. I'd stopped being cold, which I knew was a very bad sign. I'd stopped being afraid, which was probably worse. That's when he appeared. At first, I thought he was another hallucination, a product of my oxygen-starved brain conjuring comfort in my final hours. A massive shape moving through the storm with impossible ease, too large to be human, too purposeful to be an animal. He stopped at the entrance to my cave, blocking the wind, and for the first time in 9 days, I felt warmth. He looked at me with eyes that held an intelligence so profound it cut through my delirium like a knife. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that I was looking at something that shouldn't exist but did. The Yeti was real. And he had come to decide whether I would live or die. He didn't speak, couldn't speak, in any language I would have recognized. But communication happened anyway, through gestures so clear they bypassed the need for words, through expressions that conveyed meaning more precisely than sentences ever could. He studied me for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. I was too weak to be afraid, too far gone to do anything but stare back. Then he reached into a pouch, yes, a pouch, made from hide and sinew, marking him as not just an animal but a being with tools, with culture, and pulled out something wrapped in leaves. Food. Some kind of concentrated paste that smelled like nothing I'd ever encountered, bitter and sweet and earthy all at once. He gestured to his mouth, then to mine, the meaning unmistakable: eat. Every survival instinct I had left screamed warnings about unknown substances, about poisoning, about trusting something that logic said couldn't exist. But I was dying anyway, and there was something in his eyes: concern? Pity? Recognition of shared consciousness that made me trust him. I ate. The paste was revolting and wonderful simultaneously, coating my throat, sending warmth through my limbs, bringing me back from the edge of death with each swallow. Within minutes, my mind cleared. Within an hour, I could stand. He watched the entire time, patient as stone, and when I was stable enough to move, he gestured for me to follow. The storm was still raging, visibility near zero, wind that should have made travel impossible. But he moved through it like it didn't exist, and somehow, I still don't understand the physics of it, the space immediately around him was calmer, warmer, as if he carried his own microclimate. I followed in his wake, stumbling, struggling, but alive. He led me down. Not to my base camp, but to a different valley, one I'd never seen on any map. A place where hot springs bubbled up through the snow, where steam created pockets of warmth, where the terrain itself seemed to shelter us from the worst of the storm. There was a cave, much larger than my refuge had been, with signs of habitation, a fire pit lined with stones, sleeping areas covered in furs, tools arranged with obvious care. He'd brought me to his home. For 3 days, while the storm spent its fury above us, he kept me alive. Fed me, kept me warm, even tended to my frost-bitten fingers with a salve that smelled of minerals and plant matter I couldn't identify. He didn't try to communicate beyond the basics: eat, sleep, stay here, be safe. But I watched him, studied him with all the observational skills my failed academic career had taught me. He was massive, 8.5 feet tall, I estimated, with shoulders that seemed impossibly broad. Covered in fur that ranged from white on his chest to dark brown on his back and limbs. His face was flatter than an ape's, more humanoid, with a pronounced brow ridge and eye set deep beneath it. His hands had opposable thumbs and showed the calluses and scars of a life spent in harsh terrain. But it was his behavior that fascinated me most. He moved with deliberation and grace, every action efficient and purposeful. He maintained his cave with obvious care, keeping certain areas clean while letting others accumulate debris in what seemed like an organized system. He had rituals, a morning routine of checking his tools, an evening practice of sitting by the fire in what looked like meditation. This wasn't an animal. This was a person. On the 4th day, the storm broke. Sunshine flooded the valley with light so bright it hurt my eyes after days of darkness. I prepared to leave, gathering my gear, checking my remaining supplies. Enough to make it down to base camp if I was careful. Enough to survive. He stopped me. Not aggressively, he placed himself between me and the cave entrance, held up one massive hand in an unmistakable gesture: wait. Then he did something extraordinary. He picked up a stick and began to draw in a patch of dirt near the fire, his movements precise and controlled despite his large hands. He drew the mountain, a simple triangle. Then he drew a figure at the base, me. And another figure higher up, isolated, himself. He pointed to me, then to the drawing of me at the mountain's base. Then he gestured to all around us, the cave, the valley, the peaks visible through the cave mouth. Finally, he pointed to the drawing of himself, alone at the peak, and his expression shifted to something that looked unmistakably like sadness. The message was clear: you live down there, among others. I live here, alone. I nodded to show I understood. He seemed satisfied, and then he drew something else. More figures at the mountain's base, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, scratching and scraping at the rock. He made sounds, guttural, harsh, and gestured angrily at the drawing. Then he swept his hand across all of it, smearing the dirt, destroying the image. I felt cold despite the fire's warmth. You're saying we're destroying the mountain? Humans. He couldn't understand my words, but he seemed to understand my tone, my body language. He nodded slowly, then pointed at me, then at the destroyed drawing, then back at me. His meaning was brutally clear: you are part of this. You are one of them. This is just the beginning of revelations that will shake your understanding of humanity itself. Make sure you're subscribed. What the Yeti reveals about us in the coming chapters will change how you see everything. But then he did something I didn't expect. He drew the mountain again, and this time he drew two figures side by side, one large, one small. Him and me. And he placed his hand over his chest, then extended it toward me, palm up. An offering. A choice. I could leave, return to my world, forget this happened. Or I could stay, learn, understand what he was trying to tell me. I stayed. For 6 more days, he taught me. Not with words, we had no common language, but with drawings, gestures, demonstrations. He showed me how to read the mountain's moods, how to find water under snow, how to predict weather by the behavior of air currents I couldn't even feel. He shared his food, his fire, his knowledge accumulated over what must have been decades, maybe longer. But more than practical skills, he taught me to see. To notice the small destructions, the trash left by climbers, the paths cut through terrain that would take decades to recover, the way human presence disrupted patterns that had existed for thousands of years. He showed me his rage and his grief, expressed through gestures and sounds that needed no translation. And on the 7th day, when I was strong enough to travel, when my supplies were ready and my path was clear, he led me to the edge of his valley and stopped. He looked at me with those deep, intelligent eyes, and he gestured, "Go." But before I left, he did one more thing. He placed his massive hand on my chest, over my heart, and held it there. I felt warmth spread through me, felt something that was almost like words forming in my mind, though I heard nothing. Remember. Tell them. Make them understand. Then he turned and disappeared into the peaks, moving with impossible speed and grace, and I was alone again. I made it down to base camp. I told them I'd survived in an ice cave, rationing my supplies, waiting out the storm. No one questioned it. Survival stories like that were common enough in the Himalayas. I flew home, returned to my collapsed life, and tried to forget. But I couldn't forget. And 6 months later, I was back. That second meeting, in the summer of 1975, established the pattern that would define the next 50 years of my life. I came alone, hiking to the valley he'd shown me, and he was there. Waiting. As if he'd known I would return. This time, we communicated better. I'd studied sign language, learned techniques for nonverbal communication, brought pictures and objects to help bridge our gap. He was a quick learner, picking up meanings faster than I could teach them, showing an intelligence that was both humbling and terrifying. Over the course of 2 weeks, we developed a basic shared vocabulary. Not words, but concepts conveyed through consistent gestures and expressions. I learned that his people, yes, there had been more, though he was now alone, called themselves something that translated roughly to the Watchers. They had lived in these mountains for longer than human recorded history, observing, remembering, maintaining. And I learned what he thought of us. The first truth he shared shattered my comfortable assumptions about human progress. Through drawings and elaborate pantomime, he showed me the history of his contact with humans. The earliest encounters had been peaceful, curious meetings between two intelligent species, exchanges of knowledge and respect. But as human civilization grew, as we multiplied and spread, the encounters changed. We didn't just take from the mountains. We consumed them. Every generation pushed higher, wanted more, left more destruction in our wake. And his people had retreated, again and again, until there was nowhere left to retreat to. He showed me drawings preserved in his cave, ancient ones, done in charcoal and mineral pigment on stone. They depicted his people in numbers, dozens of them, living in communities across vast mountain ranges. And then, series by series, the drawings showed fewer figures, smaller groups, more isolation. The last drawing was recent, done in ash, a single figure alone against an empty landscape. Him. The last one. The second truth was worse. Through patient demonstration and crude diagrams, he explained that his people hadn't just died naturally. We had killed them. Not always deliberately, disease was the biggest killer, illnesses they had no immunity to, carried by explorers and climbers who never knew they were vectors of extinction. But sometimes deliberately, hunted for sport, for proof, for the glory of having killed a legend. His father had been shot by a British expedition in 1952. His mother had died of disease in 1967. The last of his siblings had fallen to an avalanche triggered by explosives used by a climbing team in 1971. He was alone not by choice, but because we had made him alone. I returned every year after that. Sometimes twice a year, sacrificing relationships, career opportunities, financial stability, everything that normal people build lives on. I built a life around these meetings instead, taking jobs that kept me mobile, that gave me excuses to be in Nepal, that funded my obsession with understanding what he was trying to tell me. By 1980, we had developed sophisticated communication. He'd learned to understand spoken English, though he couldn't reproduce the sounds. His vocal structure was different, capable of producing the deep vocalizations I'd first heard but not the precise phonemes of human speech. I'd learned to read his expressions, his body language, the subtle shifts in posture and gesture that conveyed meaning as precisely as words. And he began to tell me about us. About humans. About what he'd learned from decades of watching us from the peaks, observing our behavior with the clinical detachment of a scientist studying an interesting but troubling species. The third truth he shared made me sick to my stomach. Humans, he explained through our shared communication, were the only species he'd observed that destroyed beauty for profit. Other animals killed for food, defended territory, competed for mates, natural behaviors with natural purposes. But we destroyed things simply to possess them, to profit from them, to prove we could. He showed me evidence collected over decades, photographs taken from climbers' dropped cameras, showing them posing with flags on summits they'd conquered. Documents from expeditions planning to commercialize mountain access. Trash, so much trash, left behind by people who claimed to love the mountains but treated them like garbage dumps. These revelations are just beginning to scratch the surface. Subscribe now. What he reveals about human nature in the next chapters will challenge everything you believe about our species. But worse than the physical destruction was what he called the sickness of meaning. Through elaborate demonstrations using carved figures and constructed scenarios, he showed me how humans had transformed everything into symbols, abstractions, things that existed to represent other things rather than simply being. Mountains weren't mountains to us, they were challenges, conquests, achievements to check off lists. Animals weren't animals, they were resources, threats, entertainment. Even other humans weren't real to us, he suggested, unless they could benefit us or hurt us. We had lost, he indicated, the ability to see things as they actually were. We lived in a world of symbols and representations, one layer removed from reality, and we'd convinced ourselves this abstraction was sophistication rather than blindness. I argued with him, of course. Defended humanity. Pointed out our achievements, medicine, art, science, compassion. He listened patiently, then showed me the flip side of every achievement, medicine that extended lives while destroying ecosystems, art created by destroying materials, science pursued without wisdom, compassion extended selectively to those we deemed worthy. For every human virtue I named, he showed me the corresponding horror. And the worst part was that he wasn't being cruel or judgmental. He was simply observing, reporting what he'd seen with the objectivity of someone who had no stake in the outcome. By 1985, I stopped trying to defend us. Because the deeper I looked, the more I traveled, the more I lived among my own species while carrying his perspective, the more I realized he was right. The meetings continued through the decades. I got older, 30 became 40 became 50, and he seemed unchanged, ageless, permanent. Maybe his species lived longer than ours. Maybe the harsh environment preserved them. Or maybe time just moved differently at those altitudes, in that rarefied air where the normal rules seemed suspended. Each meeting brought new revelations, new truths that he'd observed and wanted to share, as if he'd appointed me his messenger to a species that wouldn't listen. By the 1990s, our communication had evolved to the point where we could discuss abstract concepts, philosophy, the nature of consciousness itself. The fourth truth nearly broke me. Humans, he explained, were unique in our ability to know we were causing harm and do it anyway. Other predators killed without guilt because they lacked the consciousness to feel guilt. But we knew, we always knew, and we constructed elaborate justifications to permit ourselves to continue. He showed me examples he'd collected from discarded materials, news articles about environmental destruction accompanied by explanations of economic necessity. Photographs of clear-cut forests with captions about job creation. Documents outlining the acceptable losses of species, ecosystems, indigenous cultures, all in service of what we called progress. We were, he indicated, the only species capable of genuine evil. Because evil required knowledge of right and wrong, required the choice to do harm despite knowing it was harm. Animals couldn't be evil, they simply acted according to their nature. But we could be, and were, evil. Routinely. Systematically. With full awareness of what we were doing. The fifth truth was somehow worse, we were teaching our children to be like us. He'd observed climbing expeditions over the years, had seen parents bringing children up the mountains, teaching them to view nature as something to conquer rather than respect. Teaching them that achievement meant domination, that love meant possession, that value meant utility. Generation after generation, we refined our destructive patterns, made them more efficient, more total, more irreversible. And we called it education, civilization, progress. The sixth truth came in 1998, during a meeting where he seemed particularly agitated, gesturing with unusual emphasis. Humans, he indicated, were destroying the future while claiming to protect it. We spoke constantly of sustainability, of preserving things for generations to come, while simultaneously consuming resources at rates that guaranteed those future generations would inherit a wasteland. We knew this. The information was everywhere, the science was clear, the evidence was undeniable. But we continued anyway, because the future was an abstraction and the present was real, because individual benefit outweighed collective harm, because we'd convinced ourselves that somehow, someone else would solve the problems we were creating. It was, he suggested, a form of insanity unique to our species, the ability to see catastrophe approaching while actively accelerating toward it. By the turn of the millennium, these meetings had become the defining feature of my life. I'd never married, who could I share this with? I'd maintained minimal employment, just enough to fund my annual pilgrimages. I lived in a small apartment filled with notes, drawings, recordings of my attempts to document everything he'd taught me. I'd tried, early on, to tell others. To share what I'd learned, to get scientists interested, to make the world understand that the Yeti was real and had things to teach us. But every attempt ended the same way: ridicule, dismissal, accusations of fraud or mental illness. The few times I'd tried to bring others to meet him, he'd vanished. Wouldn't appear, wouldn't make contact, and I'd be left looking like a madman to colleagues who'd humor me less each time. Eventually, I learned, this knowledge was mine alone to carry, this burden was mine alone to bear. The seventh truth emerged gradually over multiple meetings in the early 2000s. Humans had become addicted to stories about ourselves. We couldn't experience reality directly anymore, we had to narrativize it, turn it into plots with heroes and villains, impose meaning and structure onto events that simply happened. This, he indicated, was why we couldn't see our own destruction clearly. Because we'd cast ourselves as the heroes of history's story, and heroes didn't cause extinction, didn't create wastelands, didn't destroy beauty for profit. Those were villain behaviors, and we'd convinced ourselves we were the good guys. Every atrocity we committed came with a story that justified it, that reframed it as necessary or unfortunate but unavoidable. We were experts at crafting narratives that let us sleep at night while the world burned around us. What's revealed in the next chapters will fundamentally alter your perspective on human consciousness and our future. Don't miss it, subscribe and share this story with everyone who needs to hear these truths. The eighth truth was about intelligence itself. Humans, he showed me, had confused intelligence with wisdom, had mistaken tool-making for understanding, had convinced ourselves that because we could manipulate the world, we understood it. We were, he suggested, very clever but profoundly stupid. Clever enough to split atoms, stupid enough to use that ability to build weapons. Clever enough to modify genes, stupid enough to do it without understanding the consequences. Clever enough to connect the entire world through technology, stupid enough to use those connections primarily for distraction and conflict. Intelligence without wisdom was perhaps the most dangerous thing in the universe. And we had it in abundance. 2010 marked something different. I was 59 years old, aging badly from decades of high-altitude exposure, my body breaking down in ways that made each journey harder. But it was my mind that worried me more. Carrying his truths, seeing humanity through his eyes, had created a split in my consciousness that was becoming unbearable. I existed in two worlds simultaneously, the human world of everyday life, where people pursued careers and relationships and small pleasures, convinced of their own importance, and the world he'd shown me, where humans were a plague species rapidly consuming everything, including our own future. During that year's meeting, something happened that had never happened before. I broke down. Sobbed uncontrollably while he watched with what I'd learned to recognize as concern. I tried to explain through my tears, through our shared language of gestures and expressions, I can't carry this anymore. I can't watch us destroy everything while pretending we're not. I can't be the only one who knows and can't make anyone listen. He sat with me while I cried, his massive hand resting gently on my shoulder, and when I'd exhausted myself, he began to communicate something new. Something he'd never shared before. The ninth truth: his people had faced the same crisis. Hundreds of generations ago, when they'd been numerous and spread across vast territories, they'd reached a point of decision. They could continue their expansion, compete with emerging humans for resources and space, fight for dominance. Or they could retreat, accept smaller territories, choose decline over conflict. They'd chosen retreat. Chosen to fade rather than fight. Chosen extinction over the violence required to survive. And for hundreds of generations, they'd watched us make the opposite choice. Watched us fight for every resource, claim every territory, refuse to accept any limit on our expansion. Watched us choose survival through dominance, through consumption, through the destruction of everything that couldn't fight back. His people had thought they were choosing wisdom over violence. Now, looking at the result, his species nearly extinct, ours covering the planet, he wasn't sure they'd chosen correctly. Maybe, he suggested through elaborate gestures and expressions that took hours to fully convey, maybe wisdom meant fighting for your right to exist. Maybe choosing decline was just another form of extinction. Maybe his people had been cowards rather than wise. This thought, that even his species with their perspective and their patience might have been wrong, devastated me. Because if they didn't have the answers, if their choice had led only to their own end, then what hope was there? What lesson could be learned from their example except that the aggressive species win and the peaceful ones die? I didn't return in 2011. Couldn't. The weight of what I carried had finally broken something essential in me. I spent a year in and out of psychiatric care, diagnosed with depression, anxiety, delusional disorder, pick your label. They all meant the same thing: I couldn't function in the human world while carrying truth about the human world. But in 2012, I went back. Because despite everything, despite the horror and the helplessness, I needed to see him again. Needed to know if he was still alive, still watching, still remembering. He was there, waiting, and when he saw me he made a sound I'd never heard from him before. Something between a sigh and a groan, conveying relief and sadness in equal measure. He'd thought I wasn't coming back. He'd thought he was alone again. That meeting lasted 6 weeks, the longest we'd ever spent together. And during it, he shared the 10th truth, the final revelation, the one he'd been building toward for nearly 40 years of meetings. This final revelation will change everything. Make absolutely certain you're subscribed. What he reveals about humanity's future and our ultimate choice will shake you to your core. Humans, he explained through days of patient demonstration and communication, were not evil. We were afraid. Everything we did, the consumption, the destruction, the denial, the narrative building, all of it stemmed from terror. We were the only species that knew we would die. Not just individuals, but our entire species, our entire civilization, everything we built and believed and held dear. We knew, with absolute certainty, that eventually the sun would expand and sterilize the earth, that entropy would ultimately win, that nothing we did would matter on a cosmic timescale. And that knowledge drove us insane. So we built empires to outlast ourselves. We consumed everything to fill the void of meaninglessness. We told ourselves stories about progress and purpose because the alternative, accepting that we were temporary patterns of organization in an indifferent universe, was unbearable. His people hadn't had this burden. They lived, they died, They didn't worry about ultimate meaning or cosmic purpose. They simply existed, which was enough. But we couldn't do that. We needed everything to mean something, to matter, to persist. And because we couldn't accept our own temporariness, we were destroying the temporary beauty we'd been given. We were so afraid of meaninglessness that we were making everything meaningless. We were so terrified of death that we were killing everything. The solution, he indicated, if there was a solution, wasn't knowledge or technology or new systems. It was acceptance. Accepting that we were temporary, that our civilizations would fall, that our species would end, and that this was okay. That temporary beauty was still beautiful. That temporary existence was still worth experiencing. But we couldn't do it. We'd gone too far down the path of denial, built too many structures on the foundation of refusing to accept our own temporariness. Accepting the truth now would require dismantling everything we'd built, everything we believed, everything we used to comfort ourselves against the darkness. And so we would continue. Consuming, destroying, denying. Until there was nothing left to consume, nothing left to destroy, nothing left to deny. This was the final truth. We knew what we were doing. We knew how it would end. We knew there were other ways to live, other values to hold, other relationships we could have with the world. But we couldn't change. Couldn't stop. Couldn't accept the truth that would set us free because that truth was too terrifying to bear. We were, he indicated with a gesture of profound sadness, a species capable of understanding our own tragedy but incapable of preventing it. I've just returned from what I know will be my final meeting with him. I'm 73 years old now, too broken by age and altitude to make many more journeys. But more than that, I think he's dying. His movements were slower this year, his responses less immediate. He's ancient now, even by his species standards, and his alone. He knows its ending. His species, his culture, his memory, all of it ends with him. And there's no one to mourn it except me, a human whose own species destroyed his. During this last meeting, I asked him something I'd never dared ask before. I used our decades of shared language to pose a question that had haunted me since our first encounter. Do you hate us? After everything you've seen, everything we've done, do you hate humanity? He was quiet for a long time, staring out at the peaks that had been his home, his prison, his final territory. Then he turned to me and communicated something that broke my heart. No. He didn't hate us. Because hatred required believing that things could be different, that we could choose differently. But he didn't believe that anymore. We were what we were, doing what we did, following patterns laid down in our evolutionary history and our psychological structure. Hating us would be like hating a river for flowing downhill. But he was sad. Profoundly, eternally sad. Because we could have been something else. We had the capacity for it, the intelligence, the consciousness, the ability to see beyond immediate need to larger consequences. We could have been partners with the other species that shared this world. We could have been stewards of beauty rather than consumers of it. We could have been the species that made existence better rather than worse. But we chose not to be. And that choice, or that inability to choose differently, was what saddened him. Not anger, not hatred, but grief for the potential we'd wasted, the beauty we'd destroyed, the fellowship we'd rejected in favor of dominance and consumption. He asked me, at the end, to do one thing: tell them. Tell other humans. Make them understand, if understanding is possible. Let his observations, his truths, his perspective exist somewhere beyond his own ending. Let someone know that another intelligence watched us, judged us, and found us wanting not because we were evil but because we were capable of good and chose otherwise. So I'm writing this. All of it. Every truth he shared over 50 years of meetings, every observation about our species that we're too close to ourselves to see clearly. I'm writing it knowing that most people will dismiss it as fantasy, delusion, the ravings of an old man who spent too long at high altitudes. But maybe one person will read this and understand. Maybe one person will carry forward the perspective he gave me, the ability to see humanity from outside, to recognize our patterns and our choices and our willful blindness. The Yeti is real. I've met him for 50 years, learned from him, carried his truths like weights in my chest. And what he told me about humans, about us, about our nature and our choices and our future, is more terrifying than any monster legend could ever be. Because the monster isn't him. It's us. And we're too afraid of that truth to ever accept it. His dying alone in mountains we've invaded and commercialized, the last of a species we helped destroy, carrying observations about humanity that we desperately need to hear but will never listen to. I'm 73 years old. I've spent 50 years learning truths that I can't share, carrying knowledge that no one wants, serving as witness to humanity's tragedy from the perspective of someone outside it. And now I'm writing it all down, this final act of testimony, hoping against hope that someone will understand what I'm trying to say. We are capable of better. We have the intelligence, the consciousness, the capacity for wisdom. We could choose differently. We could accept our temporariness and find beauty in it rather than terror. We could live in partnership with the world rather than conquest of it. We could be the species that makes existence richer rather than poorer. But we won't. Not because we can't, but because we're too afraid. Too invested in our stories about ourselves, too committed to our systems of meaning, too terrified of the void that accepting truth would create. And so we'll continue. Consuming, destroying, denying, building elaborate justifications for behaviors we know are wrong. We'll tell ourselves we had no choice, that it was inevitable, that we did our best with the information we had. But we had a choice. We always had a choice. We just chose wrong. This is what the Yeti told me about humans over 50 years of meetings in the Himalayas. This is the truth he wanted someone to carry forward. This is his final message to the species that destroyed his. You are not evil. You are afraid. And your fear is destroying everything, including yourselves. This story is more than entertainment, it's a mirror showing us what we refuse to see about ourselves. If these truths resonated with you, share this video widely. Subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. The Yeti's message needs to reach as many people as possible before it's too late. We still have time to choose differently. But that time is running out. Share this story. Remember his words. And ask yourself, what choice will you make? Will you be part of the problem or part of the change? The decision is yours, but the clock is ticking. I'm writing this from a hospital bed in Kathmandu. Pneumonia, altitude sickness, general organ failure. The doctors use technical terms for what amounts to a body that spent too many years too high, breathing air too thin, carrying weight too heavy. They're giving me a week. Maybe two. But I got down from the mountain. I got these words written. And now I'm releasing them into the world, this final testimony, this witness statement from a species that's about to lose its last observer. He told me, during that final meeting, that his people had a belief. Not a religion, they were too practical for that, but a concept that shaped how they understood existence. They believed that everything that was observed continued to exist in the observation, that memory was a form of immortality, that being witnessed was the closest thing to permanence that existed in a temporary universe. His species is extinct. But I witnessed them. I carry their memory, their observations, their truths. And now I'm passing that witness to you, whoever reads this, making you complicit in their existence, making you responsible for carrying forward what they saw. You can't unlearn what you've read here. You can't unknow these truths. You can dismiss them, rationalize them, explain them away. We're very good at that. But somewhere in your mind, these observations will remain. These perspectives will persist. This witness will continue. Maybe that's enough. Maybe being observed, being remembered, being witnessed is all that any consciousness can hope for in a universe that tends inexorably toward entropy and forgetting. Or maybe, and this is what I choose to believe in my final days, maybe understanding is the first step toward change. Maybe seeing ourselves clearly, through eyes not blinded by our own narratives and justifications, is what we need to choose differently. The Yeti watched us for thousands of years. Watched us grow from one species among many to the dominant force reshaping the planet. Watched us develop technology, culture, civilization, all the things we're so proud of. And he watched us use all of that capability to destroy rather than create, to dominate rather than coexist, to consume rather than appreciate. But he also watched us develop something else, the capacity for self-reflection, for understanding our own behavior, for seeing ourselves from outside. We're the only species that can do that, can observe ourselves, judge ourselves, consciously choose to be different from what our instincts and history would make us. We just haven't used that capacity. Haven't exercised that muscle. Haven't taken the hard look in the mirror that would show us what we've become. This is that mirror. These 50 years of observations, 10 truths about humanity from a perspective unburdened by human bias and human need. This is what we look like to a consciousness that has no stake in our success, no investment in our narratives, no reason to lie to us or comfort us or tell us what we want to hear. We are afraid. We are destructive. We are brilliant and stupid simultaneously. We are capable of profound wisdom and profound foolishness. We are the species that could save the world or destroy it, and we're currently choosing destruction because it's easier, more familiar, more consistent with the stories we tell ourselves. But we could choose differently. Right now. Today. Not by grand gestures or revolutionary changes, but by small shifts in perspective, small acknowledgements of truth, small decisions to value beauty over utility, existence over profit, connection over dominance. The Yeti species chose retreat over fight, and it led to their extinction. But our choice doesn't have to be binary. We don't have to choose between domination and extinction. There's a third path: partnership, coexistence, wisdom applied to capability, consciousness used to moderate rather than justify our impulses. He couldn't show me that path because his species never found it. But he could show me where we were going wrong, could hold up the mirror that revealed our true nature. And maybe that's enough. Maybe seeing clearly is the first step toward walking differently. I'm dying. He's dying. His species is extinct. And ours is on a trajectory that ends the same way unless we choose differently. But we can choose differently. That's the hope buried in all these difficult truths, the light hidden in this darkness. We have the capacity to change, to learn, to grow beyond our fear and our need to dominate. We've just never been desperate enough or brave enough or honest enough to use it. Maybe now we will be. Maybe this witness, this testimony, This 50-year accumulation of truth will be the catalyst that shifts something. Maybe one person will read this and see themselves differently, see humanity differently, see our place in the world differently. And maybe that one person will tell another, and another. And slowly, painfully, against all our instincts and narratives and comfortable lies, we'll begin to see ourselves as we actually are. And seeing clearly, we might finally choose to be something better. That's what he wanted. Not our extinction. He was sad about his own species' end, wouldn't wish it on another. But our transformation. Our evolution from a species driven by fear and domination to one capable of living in partnership with the world that birthed us. It's possible. Everything he showed me about our capacity for destruction also showed our capacity for creation. Everything that makes us dangerous also makes us capable of wisdom. We just have to choose to use it. I'm 73 years old. I've spent 50 years carrying truths about humanity that humanity didn't want to hear. And now, in my final days, I'm releasing those truths into the world like seeds, hoping some will take root, hoping some will grow, hoping the Yeti's observations about us won't end with his species and mine but will become the foundation for something better. We are not evil. We are afraid. And if we can acknowledge that fear, accept our temporariness, embrace the beauty of temporary existence, we might finally become the species we have the capacity to be. That's his message. That's his gift. That's what 50 years of meetings in the Himalayas taught me about humanity, taught me about consciousness, taught me about the choice we face every day between fear and wisdom. The Yeti is dying alone in mountains that should have been his sanctuary but became his prison. His species ends with him, thousands of years of existence and observation and wisdom vanishing as if they never were. But they were witnessed. I witnessed them. And now you witness them through me. And maybe, just maybe, that witnessing will be enough to shift something, to change something, to help us choose differently than we've been choosing. That's my hope as I write these final words. That's my prayer, if an old skeptic can pray. That's my legacy, 50 years of meetings distilled into one simple plea. See yourself clearly. Accept what you see. Choose to be better. The Yeti's people couldn't survive in a world dominated by humans. But maybe humans can survive in a world where we remember that we're not alone, never were alone, and that other forms of consciousness are watching, judging, hoping we'll finally grow wise enough to match our capability. He's still up there, in his hidden valley, dying slowly, alone, the last witness to his people's existence. And when he's gone, there will be no one left who remembers what the world was like before we reshaped it completely in our image. Accept me. And through these words, you. We are the witnesses now. The carriers of truth. The ones who know what we are and what we could be. What we do with that knowledge is up to us. Choose wisely. Choose quickly. Time is running out. The mountains remember. The Yeti remembered. Now we must remember, and in remembering, finally change. This is Robert Chen's testimony. This is the Yeti's message. This is humanity's last chance to see itself clearly before the mirror breaks forever. The choice, as always, is ours.